A new intense chapter is unfolding in the Caribbean. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has issued a stark warning. He stated that the United States will now prevent Venezuelan oil money from reaching Cuba. He made this declaration on his social media platform using direct and forceful language. He promised, "There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero." This statement was not just a political remark. It carried the weight of a potential military threat. The U.S. might actively enforce a blockade to halt oil shipments. The world took notice of these powerful words. This sudden announcement has sent shockwaves across the region. It came just days after a significant U.S. military action in Venezuela. That operation resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. This event has fundamentally altered the political landscape of Latin America. For years, Venezuela and Cuba have maintained a close and strategic partnership. This alliance was built on shared ideology, mutual support. Now, that deep bond is under immense and unprecedented pressure. The future of their relationship hangs in the balance, with Cuba's economic stability at stake. Mr. Trump's message went further than just cutting off resources. He implied that the United States military could be used to stop the flow of oil. He also framed this as a protective measure for Venezuela. He wrote that Venezuela doesn't need protection anymore from the thugs, extortionists who held them hostage. He added that the U.S. would now provide that protection. This combination of a threat toward Cuba and a promise to the new Venezuelan leadership has raised alarms. The words were heard loud and clear in Havana, Washington capitals throughout the hemisphere, signaling a major policy shift. The gravity of the situation was underscored by other U.S. officials. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a pointed comment following the operation in Venezuela. He warned, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned." This sentiment reinforces the seriousness of the American stance. It suggests that the capture of Maduro was not an isolated event. Instead, it appears to be part of a broader strategy aimed at reshaping the political dynamics of the Caribbean. The combination of presidential threats and high-level warnings has created a climate of uncertainty and fear. Beat. The region holds its breath. The immediate cause of this crisis was a dramatic military event. On January 3, 2026, the United States launched Operation Absolute Resolve. This swift and targeted operation took place in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. The primary objective was to capture President Nicolas Maduro. U.S. forces apprehended President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, in the early morning hours. They were quickly transported from Venezuela to New York City. There, they are expected to face trial on charges brought by the U.S. justice system. This action effectively decapitated the existing Venezuelan government. The operation was not without bloodshed and significant human cost. Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado reported that the raid resulted in substantial casualties. In a public statement, he declared, "So far, there are 100 dead, 100, and a similar number injured." These figures paint a grim picture of the violence that occurred during the capture. The loss of life has added a layer of tragedy to the political upheaval. It has also fueled anger and condemnation from allies of the former Venezuelan government, who view the U.S. action as a violent and illegal invasion of a sovereign nation. This military intervention has completely changed the power structure in Venezuela. This creates a power vacuum and an uncertain future for the nation of nearly 30 million people. Cuba's response to the American threats was swift, unified, and defiant. The Cuban government refused to be intimidated by the strong language coming from Washington. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel delivered a powerful public address. He firmly rejected what he called external interference in Cuba's internal affairs. He declared that Cuba would not bow to pressure from any foreign power. His words were meant to rally his nation and send a clear message to the world. He stated, "Cuba does not aggress. It is aggressed upon by the United States for 66 years, and it does not threaten. He asserted Cuba's right to self-determination. The Cuban president also invoked a powerful sense of national pride and readiness to resist. He continued his speech by saying that Cuba prepares, ready to defend the homeland to the last drop of blood. This rhetoric taps into a long history of Cuban nationalism and resistance against perceived American imperialism. It frames the current crisis as another chapter in a long struggle for sovereignty. By using such strong and emotive language, President Diaz-Canel aimed to prepare the Cuban people for potential hardships ahead. The situation was made even more tense by Cuban casualties during the U.S. operation in Venezuela. The Cuban government officially reported a painful loss. It announced that 32 of its citizens were killed in combat actions during the raid that captured President Maduro. These individuals were likely part of the security and advisory personnel that Cuba has long provided to the Venezuelan government. Their deaths have personalized the conflict for many Cubans. It has transformed a distant political dispute into a matter of national mourning and anger, further solidifying the government's defiant stance against the United States. In response to these events, Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla condemned the U.S. actions in the strongest possible terms. He articulated Cuba's legal and moral position on the world stage. He stated, "Like any country, Cuba has the absolute right to import fuel from those markets willing to export it." He then accused the United States of acting outside the bounds of international law. He said, "The U.S. behaves like a criminal and an uncontrolled hegemon that threatens peace and security, not only in Cuba and the hemisphere, but the entire world." This strong diplomatic language highlights the deep divide and lack of trust between the two nations. Oil is the central issue in this escalating conflict for a very simple reason. For Cuba, oil is not a luxury. It is an essential lifeline. The island's entire economy and daily lives depend on a steady supply of fuel. Oil generates the electricity that powers homes. Oil generates the electricity that powers hospitals. Oil generates the electricity that powers schools. It fuels the buses that transport people and goods. It fuels the cars that transport people and goods. It runs machinery in factories. It runs machinery on farms. Without sufficient oil, basic functions of modern society would grind to a halt. This fundamental need makes Cuba extremely vulnerable to any disruption in its oil imports. Cuba does not produce enough oil to meet its domestic needs. As a result, Cuba has always relied heavily on imports to bridge the gap. To fully understand the severity of the threat, it is important to look at the specific numbers. Cuba's total oil consumption is approximately 100,000 barrels per day. This figure represents the total amount of fuel needed to keep the country running at a basic level. Any significant drop below this level of supply has immediate and noticeable effects on the daily lives of the population. The stability of the nation's energy grid is directly tied to its ability to secure this daily amount of oil. Of this 100,000 barrel per day requirement, Cuba produces less than half domestically. Therefore, the country must import more than 50,000 barrels every single day just to meet its needs. Last year, Venezuela supplied Cuba with an average of 26,500 barrels per day, covering roughly 50% of Cuba's oil deficit. Losing that supply would create a massive hole in the energy budget. Finding an alternative source for that volume on short notice would be an enormous challenge, especially given Cuba's limited financial resources and existing economic sanctions. For much of the past 5 years, many Cubans have lived with daily power outages. The country has faced persistent shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. An abrupt end to Venezuelan shipments would dramatically worsen the crisis. It would threaten to push Cuba's economy and society to a breaking point. Venezuela's role in this crisis is both central and complex. Under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela pursued strong solidarity with Cuba. The cornerstone was oil for doctors, subsidized oil in exchange for Cuban services. Services included medical personnel, teachers, and intelligence advisors. The U.S. operation that removed Maduro has shattered this long-standing partnership. The new government faces immense pressure from Washington to sever ties with Havana. Continued American support is conditional. Stop oil shipments and financial support for Cuba. Comply and gain aid to rebuild. Refuse and risk legitimacy and regional backlash. Whether to continue or cut off oil to Cuba will be an early, defining test. The standoff carries risks that extend far beyond the two countries. A sudden economic collapse in Cuba could trigger a massive humanitarian crisis. It could lead to a new wave of migration by sea, burdening neighbors including the United States, Mexico, and other Caribbean nations. Politically, the hemisphere could split, even paralyzing regional bodies. Intercepting tankers implies a naval blockade, considered an act of war under international law. Even a small clash at sea could spiral, harm commerce, and crater tourism. Leaders are urging caution, warning a miscalculation could be catastrophic for the Western Hemisphere. Beat. The stakes are rising by the hour. As this crisis unfolds, there appear to be three main paths that events could take. The first and most hopeful path is negotiation. Diplomats could engage in talks to find a peaceful resolution. The U.S. might ease threats in exchange for concessions from Cuba, political reforms, or reduced foreign intelligence activities. A diplomatic solution would prevent immediate conflict and foster long-term stability. A second path is slow economic strangulation. Pressure Venezuela to taper oil, tighten Cuba's financial access. This avoids blockade risks but inflicts prolonged humanitarian pain. The third and most dangerous path is military escalation. Direct interdictions would spark condemnation and risk a wider conflict. Lives on all sides would be at risk, destabilizing the entire Caribbean. This worst-case scenario is what all responsible parties hope to avoid. Decisions in Washington, Havana, and Caracas will determine the path. The world is watching, hoping dialogue prevails over confrontation. Beat. Time is short. In summary, the threat to cut off Venezuelan oil to Cuba has ignited a serious international crisis. This is not just a political dispute. Energy security, military power, decades of historical baggage. For Cuba, the potential loss of its primary oil supplier represents an existential threat to its economy and stability. For the United States, it is a bold power play aimed at dismantling a long-standing alliance it views as hostile. The actions of Venezuela's new government will be critical. The stakes could not be higher. A misstep could lead to a severe humanitarian crisis in Cuba, widespread blackouts and shortages. It could also trigger a dangerous military confrontation. The world is at a crossroads: peaceful diplomacy or risky conflict. The best outcome is a negotiated settlement that addresses security concerns while protecting the Cuban people. Watch for official statements from the White House, State Department, the Cuban government, and Venezuela. Monitor shipping data and news from Caribbean ports. Tanker movements will be the first concrete sign. Follow reports on fuel, electricity, and basic goods inside Cuba to gauge the human impact. Will diplomacy prevail, or will the region slide toward a new and dangerous conflict? The answer is not yet clear. We will continue to follow this story closely and provide updates as they become available. For now, all eyes are on the Caribbean, where a high-stakes standoff over oil and power is just beginning. We will be here to report on the next developments in this and other news. So subscribe to PulsePoint News and leave your like, supporting our work. Thank you for watching. Thank you.